we can start with the quote, and then you can no, you can call the bell. If you we are gonna read a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, as Annie says, as just said, and Tai says to us, when practicing generosity, we should consider everyone equal. Some people think that they can only practice generosity if they are wealthy. This is not true. Practicing generosity means to act in a way that will help equalize the difference between the wealthy and the impoverished. Thank you so much. And Annie, if you can start with the bell.
So dear friends, I'm going to invite the bell 3 times so we can just settle into our bodies and really arrive here today. And in that way, we can be more present to really hear what we're going to be hearing, and enjoy it and take it in. Turn on my original sound. So this evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Jennifer Neer and Nwamaka Agbo. I will be introducing Nwamaka, but I met both of these women on Maestro retreats through the Justice Funders, which is a project of rethinking philanthropy. And both of these women are really long time. They've done their whole career in this field, and I hope you really will enjoy them as much as I have enjoyed and learned from them. So Nwamaka, Nwamaka is a restorative economics practitioner, and she brings a solutions-oriented approach to her project management consulting. Nwamaka has a background in organizing, electoral campaigns, policy and advocacy on racial, social, and environmental justice issues. Nwamaka supports projects that build resilient, healthy, and self-determined communities rooted in shared prosperity. So welcome, Nwamaka. We're so happy to have you here. And Adriana will introduce Jennifer.
So I'm Jenny. We are also so grateful to have Jennifer Neer with us. And Jennifer supports philanthropic organizations in adopting and accelerating their practice of the just transition. Her work includes developing strategies to redistribute land, wealth, and power in the field of philanthropy and working to align philanthropic practices with grassroots leadership and communities' vision for cooperative and regenerative economy. Welcome, Jennifer. Welcome, Nwamaka, and thank you so much for being here tonight with us. And the space is yours now. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introductions, Annie and Adriana. And really honored to be co-presenting with my dear friend, Jennifer Neer. So yes, my name is Nwamaka Agbo. I am based out of Oakland, California, and I primarily operate as an independent consultant, and I provide project management support to community-owned and governed projects, as well as also providing strategic advice to philanthropies, investors, and donors about how to move their resources in mission-aligned ways. And I think by terms of like my own self-introduction, I just wanted to name for everybody kind of listening in on our conversation today, that initially when we were invited to kind of participate, we had planned a very different program, and just kind of given the state of the world, Jennifer and I, with the support of Annie and Adriana, thought it would be helpful to really kind of rethink our conversation and set it in the context of what's happening with the Black Lives Matters uprising across the country and around the world. And so we are going to have a loosely held conversation, a bit more informal today, but hope that folks can kind of hold us in having an honest and incomplete conversation as we kind of process some of the world's events together in the context of what it means to give and support. But would love to pass it off to Jen.
Thanks, Nwamaka. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an honor to always co-present with Nwamaka, a dear friend and colleague in the work. And thanks Annie and Adriana for making space for this conversation. Again, I'm Jennifer Neer. My pronouns are she, her. I live in Southeast New Hampshire, and I work mostly as program director for the Maestra program, the one that Annie mentioned, but I also do work on the side as a consultant, supporting informal funder organizing and donor organizing projects, supporting institutions and individuals in moving their resources in aligned ways, and also in just supporting grassroots efforts in my own community as a resource mobilizer and as an organizer. And I appreciate, Nwamaka, you kind of framing us. It's interesting in this moment because everything that we would have presented on and talked about is still true, and yet the level of crisis requires us to enter into the conversation in a different place. And so one of the things that we really lean into in this work and how we show up in relationship to communities and the movements we work in is to be highly adaptive and supportive as things shift and evolve. And that's a really kind of key part, I think, of being in right relationship and practice. So I think before we fully dive into more of the informal content that we've shifted, we were just going to take a minute just to say a little bit about like what's going on in our communities, because that just feels really present right now. So I'm happy to just start, and then maybe Nwamaka, I can pass it back to you. And then Annie, I know you were going to share a little bit about what's going on and also just your experience around like giving and also like what you're thinking about in terms of your own giving in this moment. I would say in my community, things feel really strange and heartbreaking. It's strange on the one hand because the level of state violence here isn't as extreme in terms of organized, sanctioned police violence, and at the same time, there's a very strong right-wing armed militia presence in my community. So one of the ways I've been showing up is as a de-escalator and a peacekeeper at some of the actions here, and folks who are organizing in support of Black lives are being surveilled, we are being videotaped, we are being photographed. There's a level of intimidation, and folks, here it's an open carry, so we're very visibly armed. We had somebody show up to march on Saturday and just stand silently in the corner holding a Confederate flag. So it feels really hostile and scary. And we know that their vision for what comes on the other side of this is dramatically different than the vision that we hold around equity and justice. And they're organized and they're present. So that's what my community feels like right now. Nwamaka, is there anything you want to share?
Yeah, I think what I would add, and particularly obviously from the perspective as a Black woman doing this work, is just want to acknowledge that collectively around the world, we've already been sustaining a level of stress and trauma given the global pandemic. And so when the uprisings kind of broke, there was a way in which it was a re-injury. It opened up an old wound, particularly for Black communities that have had to witness this type of attack and trauma over and over again. And so I would say in my personal life, both friends and families, I'm actually watching a lot of friends and colleagues struggle with mental health stability. I'm watching people kind of reach their snapping point or their breaking point, just kind of given that they've already been under duress, and this is kind of one more thing. And then I think collectively in Oakland, it's very different actually than, I'm glad we're talking about this, Jen, because Oakland has a history of direct action and political engagement. And so there's a way in which it speaks to the needs and a lot of the frustration that people have been holding onto within their home as we've kind of watched our federal government completely mess up the handling of the COVID-19. And so there's a way in which people taking to the streets is finally allowing people to release and process a lot of that anger and frustration. And I think also because we have a history of direct action and political engagement, the people are also bracing themselves for the deep police repression that comes as well. And so it's just interesting to kind of reflect on the ways that people are taking on political activity in Oakland. I know that we have a curfew in effect at 8 p.m. and there's a concerted effort to actually stay out past curfew as a way of being able to defend our right to protest. And so also bracing ourselves for what it means for folks to defy curfew, defy a state-sanctioned limitation on protest and what that means. So I think, yeah, it's interesting to see from the East Coast to the West Coast, urban to rural, and how different communities are either responding to the moment, have different capacities to engage in different ways, or seeing the moment kind of visibilize different tensions of the same kind of conflict, conversation, and struggle that we're collectively having. And so we know we also have Annie in Washington, D.C. that also has a very particular political context. And I think we also saw nationally what's happening in D.C. And this is also a place where you and your family have committed to some giving. And so would love for you to maybe kind of set us up in the context of sharing a bit more about what you're experiencing and the history and how your giving story has kind of lent itself to this moment.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to share. I don't want to take too much time away from y'all, but so yes, here in DC, it's been interesting. I'm sure you've read a lot about it, but for one thing is that the curfew tonight has been extended to 11. There's a little bit of like a back and forth, I think, with our mayor and the president almost, like there's kind of a funny little struggle happening there. But there are a lot of people out every day, more people, and actually getting more peaceful, it seemingly. So I think Saturday is supposed to be a big day here, a very big day in Washington. So we shall see. But on my story of giving, so we started out, my husband started making some extra money and we wanted to be able to give it away because I didn't grow up with a ton of money. And so I really didn't like this idea of hoarding money or having extra money. And so we started out just sort of in the usual way, giving it away. And we created a family foundation, but we were giving kind of to service. We were giving to like whatever people felt like giving to. And, you know, it was good. It was a good beginning. And we started really getting getting this habit of giving and looking for places to give. And after a few years, our daughter Hannah did some work with Resource Generation, which is an amazing organization for young people with wealth who are looking to use that wealth for social justice causes. And she came back and suggested that we start thinking differently about how we give money. And one of the ways that we have shifted our thinking is how do we use this money instead of just to like keep helping people, which is not a bad thing, but so many people are helping in this service industry. So many people give to hospitals, so many people give to organizations that are doing on the ground service work, homelessness, things like that. But she said that there are not many people giving to really shift the power dynamic in the world, to shift the systems. And so she really educated me on this and brought in other people who have helped to educate us on this. And it's so in alignment with my practice, my mindfulness practice, and what I care about in the world, because I don't want to always be in a position of having money and giving money. Like, I don't want that. That's not the world that I want to live in. I want to live in a world where everybody has what they need, and that it's not always the same people who are handing out to the same other people. but that we're shifting the dynamic in such a way that everybody can have what they need and everybody can give and receive. And so by using the resources that we have to give to organizations that are on the ground doing the work, led by the people doing the work, organizing people to develop more power for frontline communities, then I feel like we are making that difference. We are having the impact where we are shifting some of the power and money that we have to other groups of people, other communities. So for me, it was first a learning about where to put the money. It was like, okay, so here's where we're going to shift the money. But then it was a learning about, well, how do we actually start letting go of the decision making around the money even? Like, how do we give up the power that we have? So yeah, so it's been a kind of step-by-step learning. And so we've been, over this last year, our foundation has decided to give to a larger umbrella organization, to give more to an umbrella organization that then will choose which of the smaller organizations will get the money. So we're giving a larger amount to Movement for Black Lives, and then within that, they're choosing which of the local organizations need it and will get it. So even though there's no way to fully give up the decision-making power, we're trying to edge closer to that. So that's been our process, and I'm so grateful to Hannah, to Justice Funders, to Luke Newton, who's been our consultant, to all the people who have helped us to make this progress, because I feel like this is one of the key pieces of shifting the world, is to shift this power and money in ways that that really can make a big difference. So I'm very passionate about it, as you can see. So thank you for giving me a moment to share.
Thank you, Annie. So what Jen and I had planned is roughly for the next 10 minutes, we were both going to take an opportunity to respond to two reflection questions that we've been sitting with. And I'm going to try to drop it in the chat box if I can get my thing to work, in case, I don't know why my not working. I'll deal with it later. Two reflection questions, and thanks, Jen. And I would offer that once again, like, these are incomplete thoughts as we're kind of still forming our own analysis around the moment and how to connect it to giving, but would invite you all, as you're kind of listening to us share some of our reflections, also kind of take in these reflection questions for yourself. And so the first question is, you know, inviting people to kind of share how you're doing and what are you reflecting on in this moment. And I would say that for me, in terms of how I'm doing, I think this is a really difficult moment. It's hard to stay present and active in the work, particularly wanting to be out on the streets. And I would say that this is a moment that it feels really hard to have to justify your humanity and your right to live with dignity. And so I've been really sitting with, in a matter of a few months, from COVID-19 to the uprisings that are happening, we've seen Black people be disproportionately impacted on both ends. And COVID-19 really helps to expose a lot of the weaknesses and failures in our public health system. And the police brutality really exposes the failures of our justice system. Many call it the injustice system. And for me and Jen, we spend a lot of time really talking to the philanthropies that we're a part of about the racial wealth gap. And I think these two moments in history have also really helped to visualize that while the racial wealth gap really characterizes disparities with who has access to capital and income, it doesn't really fully capture the depth of the disparities within these communities. And particularly, I think that the divide that we're looking at is a health and well-being divide. And this, unfortunately, is a place where we see Black people on the losing end of all of it. And so when we have a country, a society where it's almost taboo to talk about race, now we see that race has bubbled up in the forefront in a way that we can't deny. I think that it's one of the places where we've been forced to have the conversation that we've been shying away from. I think the other thing that has been coming up, and Jen and I have talked about this a little bit, and I chatted with my husband about this the other day, is that there's a narrative that's also happening across the media around really wanting to protect property and really wanting, saying that the role of the police is to actually protect property. And this is extremely painful for a people where descendants, and I should offer, I'm Nigerian American, so my parents actually came to the States in '79, so enslavement isn't a direct part of my lineage. And I would say that by the blessings that I have to walk this earth in a Black skin, I oftentimes still experience the same levels of microaggressions and fear for my brothers' lives and their safety in the same way. And so the history of slavery, while it's not directly in my lineage, it's something that I still identify given my experience in this country in a Black body. And so when we think about the fact that we have a police force that is really being pushed on to protect property, and at one point, the history of our country is one in which Black people, people stolen from Africa, were regarded as chattel slavery, right? We're regarded as property. And now in a moment where we see people being murdered in the streets, we are, some people, the narrative for some communities is that there is more of a value on that property than there is on Black lives. And so while, 400 years ago, we may be regarded as property, in 2020, we have a narrative now where we're seen as less than valuable as property. And so that's also extremely painful. And really wanting people to really grapple with the fact that the way that we've developed our country, kind of the history of our economy, is one in which we've always kind of privileged capital and profit and property over people. And the ways that we allow for the protection of private property, but we don't defend the rights of the commons. We actually don't defend or stand up against corporations that are polluting our water and our air systems or extracting natural resources from the ground. And so to the story that Annie shared about Hannah really lifting up the need to have a deep investigation about where power sits and how power and who gets to hold power and claim it and exercise it is also really shaping the conversation, and not the conversation just in this moment, but has kind of been a subtone in how we've developed our society as well. And so for me, I'm really inviting people that I work with and in community with to start taking a deeper look at the interconnection of economy and government. Some of us may recall when we were seniors in high school, we took our econ class right alongside our government class. And that's because the role of government, ideally, right, is to kind of intervene and manage market forces and manage the economy so that we protect it for the good of all people. But since we have an economic system, one that's capitalism, it means that we continue to privilege profit over people and the planet. And I would actually say that right now we see capitalism also really shaping our democracy, our form of government. And I actually pull away from even calling it democracy anymore to actually referring to it as a corporatocracy. The fact that we would once again defend these high-rise buildings, defend these big corporations, make it possible for the Amazon to go without paying taxes, but then incarcerate and murder people that are trying to manage some type of dignified living for themselves and their communities. And those are the disparities that we need to be aware of, and those interconnections as well. I think we need to really take a close look at understanding how hand in hand gerrymandering, voter suppression is also interconnected with the undermining of our public health systems, our education systems, and therefore the inability for people to have the resources that they need to take care of themselves. And so these uprisings, if anything, I would liken them to kind of the simmer that sits in Black people on a day-to-day basis, and has actually just reached a boiling point, and we have actually just taken the lid off of it. But what we're experiencing in the streets now is actually something that many of us experience regularly. And because we have denied to take a close look at it, we've been forced to actually put it in front of people in a way that's undeniable. And I think I'll kind of like close and get off my soapbox and hand it off to Jen, before we go into the next question, there was a quote that we kind of shared with Annie and the rest of the cohort when we were kind of taking a close look at racism and capitalism. And I think a lot of the amazing reporting from the 1619 series by the New York Times, both the written articles and the podcast by Nicole Hanna, and then the work of Ibram X. Kennedy, who recently wrote the book How to Be Anti-Racist. Really, Ibram X. Kennedy sums it up beautifully when he says, you can't be anti-racist and believe in capitalism. And so our ability to really understand how political struggle sits within that intersection of addressing racism and addressing capitalism, and why we feel the need to have direct action and civil unrest and protest as a part of our overall toolbox and strategies for how to create change. Everywhere from policy advocacy to electoral organizing also needs to be able to have room for civil disobedience and direct action. And unfortunately, while we want to why we may kind of have a hard time engaging in a conversation about violence, I think our country has been a violent country. And that's why, unfortunately, we do see it as part of the struggle, whether we invite it or not. It's there because that is the tone that has been set by the founding of the United States. And so, Jen, would love to kind of invite you into this question to sit with, let us know how you're doing and what are you reflecting on this moment and what's coming up for you.
Thanks, Nwamaka. I think I just want to share an invitation that somebody once shared with me, in this work with everyone, and just to say, Nwamaka and I are going to do this little bit of riffing. That's Nwamaka riffing, which is also just like, what the heck, this stuff just comes together. So we're going to do this little bit of riffing, and then we also are going to break you out into groups so that you all can kind of share what's coming up for you in this moment, how you're making sense of things, and how that could inform the ways that you might give and move resources. But, just one thing, as somebody who identifies as white, I come from more of a rural, working middle class background, but somebody who has really tried to move in this work and grow over the last several years, who didn't come in with as much of a political analysis or didn't really have language around anti-capitalism and even racism earlier on when I entered into this work. There's a way in which there's just so much undoing and unlearning. And so one of the things that somebody once said to me was notice when your chest gets tight or you feel resistance in your body, because sometimes before we can even intellectually process what people are saying that might be in some way we want to express some sort of dissent to it or contradiction to it. A lot of times it's coming up in our body, and it's just so many of the things we've been conditioned around. So I just invite folks to just be present, if you feel any kind of way about anything we're saying, because that's just real. We've been conditioned to respond, to not talk about these things, to have certain sort of physiological responses in our body. So I just want to invite that. What is coming up for me that I can say in addition to everything Nwamaka just shared? I think I'm reflecting a lot about history. I'm reflecting a lot about how I've come into this work in my path. The murdering of Michael Brown and the protesting in Ferguson and the evolution of Black Lives Matter in that time, as well as going into the 2016 election and the election of Trump, feel really present for me because they felt like catalytic moments as well. And part of my role in that work then and now has been to support folks who identify as white, moving through their emotions and growth in alignment, hopefully, with Black leadership in these political uprisings and these catalytic political moments. I think some of the things I'm struggling with is for folks who have been, involved in organizing, involved in resource distribution like Nwamaka and I, and even just folks who have been generally engaged in political and civic engagement and elections. We had already seen this, rising level of extreme right wing, like the extreme right wing in our country being highly organized, having a lot of power, shaping the public discourse, shaping policies, shaping the executive branch, the judicial branch. And, you know, so that was sort of like present in a lot of ways. And I think we've struggled around what are the forms of power that we want to engage in on the left. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through. But I think, you know, what's been extremely hard in this moment is not only are those forces organized all around us and acting counter to equity and justice and the movements that are uprising right now, but they're also like so represented by our state. Our state is acting in an authoritarian, violent, militarized capacity in service to the extremist, authoritarian, fascist, and other violent militant interests in our country. And that is just the reality of where we sit in this moment. And I always caution, like, you know, how we engage in this subject, because I don't ever want it to provoke any kind of fear. But I think it's just one of the things that Nwamaka and I talk about is how do we figure out a level of redistribution and support to communities that is commensurate to the harm that has been caused, and the level of power with folks who do not value the dignity and the humanity of Black life. Like, what is the level of response that is commensurate to those forces? And I'm just very much thinking about that right now, because we've seen the way that the state has no hesitation in acting in violent ways. And I think the other thing I'm reflecting on is, even as we express dissent, those of us who feel like we have the safety to do so, we are being met with violent force. So what does that say about our ability to stand up and demand something else in this moment? And I find that very, very troubling for our democracy, for the state of our country, for the dignity and humanity of Black communities and Black individuals, and how we're going to continue to organize and respond in this moment. A couple other things I would just say quickly is I think there's always a challenge to engage in this conversation and to meet folks where they are. You know, some of you may just be entering into a conversation about race and racism. Some of you may have been in this conversation for years. And there's always this sense like we have to kind of, you know, bring folks along. And I do believe in that. And I have to say, the level of transformation that we are seeking is enormous. We're talking about systems, as Nwamaka was saying. The very intent of these systems is to produce what is happening right now. I mean, our police force came to be as slave patrols. Our healthcare system came to be as one that protected white and folks with some level of class privilege from folks who were unhoused post-slavery in the Reconstruction era, and who had the chance, just like now, of increasing the spread of pandemic because they didn't have the ability to quarantine or be in structures. And that's the foundation of our healthcare system. The foundation of our government and our economy is one on stolen land, labor, and culture. And so how do we meet folks where they are? And also say the level of transformation, the reorganization of our economy, our democracy, and our very sort of culture and cosmos, which means like our worldview about who we value and why and who these systems serve, has to completely transform. And so I'm just sitting with that tension of wanting to hold people with tenderness and help them to figure out how to navigate this moment and what is needed in order to honor the humanity and dignity of Black life. And Nwamaka, I'm happy to ask you the second question, if you want to reflect quickly, and then we can break out. So as you all may notice, I mean, we do some of this work by moving resources, but of course it's so much more than that. But we also just wanted to share what was on our hearts, and then also try to connect it to how we think you all could be thinking about how that informs your giving and other ways of acting in this moment. So Nwamaka, I'm just curious, as somebody who both mobilizes resources and I'm sure gives resources, just what this moment is sort of like, yeah, what you're thinking about in terms of how this moment informs giving for you.
Sure, and I'll try to be quick so we can move to our breakout groups. You know, Jen, the piece that you offered about transformation, I think it's really important to underscore that transformation isn't something where we study first and then go out and practice what we learn. There's the opportunity for us to be transformed through the doing of the work. I think Mary Hooks from Southerners on New Ground in Atlanta actually calls it, yeah, allow yourself to be transformed through the work. And so there's a place where there's a level of urgency that requires us to act and requires us to move as intentionally as we can, knowing that we may stumble, but that's where the learning comes in, where we're willing to actually learn from what it means to kind of stumble. And all that to say, I think this moment is also what I appreciate about how donors and philanthropies and financial institutions have kind of moved to rapid response around COVID-19, and some also kind of supporting Black-led organizing, is that people have help to kind of flow those resources very quickly in this moment of crises. And I would offer that what we're seeing now is oftentimes what's happening on a day-to-day basis in communities. So also inviting people to think about how they're giving in this moment is not just a one-off, but can also really help to shape and inform their ongoing giving over a period of time. And that Jen and I often kind of talk about what does it mean to be in right relationship with impacted communities, with social movements on the ground, and how do we come to understand how to kind of honor the autonomy of those groups to make decisions on how to use their resources. And so I think Annie lifted up a really beautiful model with the Movement for Black Lives and how this organization has self-organized a number of Black-led grassroots organizations across the country to actually be a vehicle to receive capital so that they can then redistribute it out to groups on the ground. And so our ability to cultivate relationships with groups and social movements in relatively calm times is what then allows us to act and move quickly during these moments of crises, right? Because we can actually lean in on the trust that we have with these groups to move the resources. And so last on this piece, I think for me and my work on restorative economics for me has always been kind of rooted in ensuring that we're bringing a racial analysis, and I would also offer gender justice analysis to who we are reinvesting in, particularly the Black, Indigenous, Brown, and communities of color, immigrant communities that have been extracted from and exploited from. And so I always ask people to think really intentionally about who we are investing in, right? Who are the people? How do we have an assessment around the racial wealth divide? What we are investing in, what are the projects that are actually supporting Black liberation, Black self-determination and autonomy, and then how are we investing in? Are we rooted in right relationship, or are we being prescriptive, and are we unduly wielding our power as a donor, or are we actually being in committed struggle with folks? So I think those are some guiding questions that have helped to support me. So I think about my own giving, and then I also kind of support people who are interested in being in deeper solidarity with social movements, but have questions about how to do that. And then on this question, Jen, I wanted to see if you had anything to add in terms of how you're thinking about this current social and political moment, and how it kind of helps you think about how we give money in this moment.
Yeah, thanks, Nwamaka. I think this moment, and even some of the work that you and I have done, you know, in COVID and prior to these two intersecting crises, it's such an opportunity for cross-class work and showing cross-class solidarity. So even though I don't identify as like a person of wealth, like I said, I come from more of a working and middle-class background, you know, I look for ways to redistribute as much of the resources that I have as possible, and to really do it through a solidarity and a mutuality frame, and not one of charity. So it's really about, like, if I have resources that I do not need, and there are folks in need of resources, that's an act of mutuality and solidarity. It's not an act of charity. And I feel like that's a frame that I'm really trying to live into personally, and in the way that I support others in the work. Another thing I will say is, you know, I'm feeling the tension around really leaning into the relationships I have, like you said, and cultivating relationships over many years, and how those relationships inform what the needs are, and being able to move money in ways that I know kind of like what the needs are, how to support. But also like in this moment of crisis where it's accelerating across so many communities in which I and we may not all have relationships, also just moving the money and trusting that it's going where it needs to go. And continuing to try to build relationship. And, you know, one of the things I would also say as somebody who identifies as white in this work, I feel like there's just no room for ego. There's no room for a sense of entitlement. And what I mean by that is like, a lot of the times what happens in this work is folks who control resources or want to give resources feel as though they have some right to say what the activity around organizing should look like, how the money should be spent, and what the outcome should be. And I think it's just such an important practice, as Annie was saying, and you were lifting up, to exercise a letting go of that control and needing to somehow like think of yourself as a broker in the change process, which often is very much rooted in ego, and instead really just leaning into the trust and the self-determination and agency of communities in this moment, previously and in the future, to really know how they need to respond in a way that honors their own dignity. So those are the things that I've been really kind of reflecting on it. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, again, there's not time to give like a full history here, but there's so much about the movement of money in social movements and history that really can inform this moment and struggles and beautiful things. And, you know, I think I've been trying to move money to Black-led community organizing work, definitely bail funds. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the giving that we're seeing in this moment. Also just base building groups who are in the long-term struggle for equity and justice. And then one of the areas I've felt, I don't know if it's challenged by what's like kind of a growth area for me, is like moving direct cash assistance to folks, whatever they need, just, you know, whatever they need. Like why isn't that part of the ecosystem of giving? And that's just been an area of exploration for me, actually from COVID, even before this political uprising, and that feels really present now. If organizers need a generator or a megaphone or whatever, you know, it's just like we need more money to flow to whatever is needed right now in these moments of crisis.
Thanks, Jen. And so with that, we're going to invite Adriana to break us out into breakout groups. We're going to have roughly 35 people. We'll have roughly 5 people in a group if possible, Adriana. I think that's about seven different groups. And we'll take, let's go for 15 minutes. If we could plan to return back by 5:05, and we'll do kind of a high-level report out. In a moment, we will drop the discussion questions in the chat box, but you'll have an opportunity to kind of flow through these questions as they resonate with you, and then identify one person who can give like one high-level takeaway from your conversation. And that's also our opportunity to kind of hear with what's sitting with all of you based on what we've shared, but also kind of the moment that we're all a part of. So I'm going to stop talking and leave it to Adriana.
Mm-hmm.
In and out of breakups, but I think this is our group. So we just want to hear how that was for you. We want to invite one person for each group just to share a quick reflection on how that was, or any kind of like key themes that came up. So feel free to unmute yourself and just go ahead, and I'll try to manage in case we have like 4 people who unmute at once, but don't everyone jump in all together. So would anyone like to start and share a little bit about their breakout? I see Bambi.
Yep. I'm going
Great.
to hope, is it Irene who was just speaking in our group? I can't see her. So I wouldn't say there was one particular theme, so I just want to quote what Irene, or I couldn't read her name, I think it's Irene's father, she's from Mexico, and what her father used to say: there are only 3 ways of giving: giving money, giving your time, or giving your time and your money. And I thought that was very succinct. There's no limits. but other people
Thank
in our
you.
group might have had something else.
Oh, that's a good idea. I love that folks have facilitation contributions. Okay. I don't know which group you were in, but if that wasn't group one, breakout room one, does somebody from breakout room one want to share?
That was from group one.
Great. Breakout room two.
This is Bea. I'm not so sure what group I was in. I don't think I remember the number, but I'm happy to share from my group. I think one of the people in my group, and I don't remember everybody's name, I apologize, said they work for an organization that prevents trafficking, but in doing so, they also work with law enforcement. And so this person was wondering, about the partnerships and, how that plays out, and whether some of these partnerships may not always be good, and he never thought about that. And so he was sitting with that. And then I expressed also some wondering, like, as someone who's doing a podcast on reentry from prison, I'm a white woman, so I want to elevate the voices of returning citizens, and how to keep that balance in terms of doing the legwork, but not taking over. I don't want to necessarily co-host, but I haven't yet. Right now we have reporters that are all returning citizens, but we don't have a lot of money to pay them. And so, I struggled with that, and I shared that. And then I think Camille helped me out. I know she shared that about giving, and sort of how to, instead of giving more mindfully, and giving not just here and there, but with a strategic process. And I'm sorry, there was another person in my group. Feel free to jump in and share, because I don't remember everybody's comments. It's the end of the day. My head is kind of all over the place. But I think we were all, one of you, maybe it was you, Nwamaka, you said something about, in the beginning conversation about, oh yeah, the giving. It was your colleague who said something about giving in terms of solidarity versus charity. I think that resonated with one member of my group, and that's a very powerful statement. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that was Jen's wisdom. It was great.
Yeah, but with lots of co-thinking with Nwamaka. So, yeah. But thank you. Others that want to give a quick share out from their conversation?
I can share from group three. Three people had time to speak, and I had started to. Generally, there was a feeling being overwhelmed. One of our members really was quite anxious. There's so much happening all at once with COVID and with this. As we ended, I started to relate that my mother, who's 75 years old and has lived in the United States her entire life, had texted me just saying, Netherlands, Sweden, and Ireland protesting by thousands for us. Ireland protesters at U.S. Embassy demanding justice for us, exclamation point. I later talked to my uncle, and I think it's important to have this perspective because this totally changed how I felt about everything going on. My uncle, Doug, who's 76, who was picking cotton as a teenager and ended up getting a PhD at MIT, he said, I asked him, how do you feel? And he's, oh, pretty good. And I was like, why? He said, it's different this time. He said, I said, how? He said, well, in the 70s and 60s when this happened, it was just Black people. You didn't see anybody internationally. You didn't see white people getting arrested and brutalized in the street by the cops on behalf of this cause, the way you're seeing it now. You didn't see these kinds of happenings. So it's all of a sudden we are seen in a way that just didn't happen, even though everything that people are now witnessing on cell phone cameras has been happening for, 400 or 500 years. So, it left me much more hopeful, because there are many, many more people. And sadly, I would finally add is like, this may be new to a lot of people, but it's also not new to a lot of people. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And maybe just in the time that we have invite, if there's just any other final reflections that anyone feels called to share, and then we're just going to reflect a little bit more on kind of ways to move through giving in this moment, and then we'll have a few minutes for any sort of burning questions, and we can follow up with resources as well. But yeah, is there anyone else that feels really called to share something that came up in their group?
Well, I'll report from group 5, and it kind of leads into what you're going to next, because in addition to sharing, we had 3 people in our group, and AD comes from a conservative rural California community, and he was surprised that and it's a small community, but 4 marches that were a mixture of people in the community that he didn't expect to see, that they were peaceful and they brought out people, different races. And then we moved from there into talking about just more intentional giving to organizations that really truly promote social justice causes. So all 3 of us are heightening our awareness and wanting to do more in that area. So that kind of leads into what you're planning to talk about next.
Great, thank you, Cornelia. And so I'll offer, in a moment, we are going to be sharing a number of different links and resources in the chat box. We will also follow up with Annie and Adriana after the call to email those to you guys as well, in case you're not able to kind of fully access them through the chat box. I see a question, but I'm gonna share my pieces really quickly. So in terms of what we would invite you guys to think about as you move through your giving, I think there's one piece around like taking a moment to assess what you're able to give, particularly being able to understand is kind of giving your time. I forget who had kind of shared the framework, I think Bambi. If you're able to actually be in solidarity with and being able to kind of show up as a direct ally in those spaces. Please assess your capacity for how to engage in direct protest. People oftentimes get trained to show up in those spaces. So being able to assess the time that you can give. I also invite people to think about, there's a list of resources in terms of a number of the on-the-ground bail funds who have been arrested. And so doing the research to understand, is there a bail fund in your local community or in a nearby community that you can resource or support? Is there a Black-led organization, grassroots organization that's providing direct support to be able to support and resource them as well? In the event that you don't have the time, the resources to kind of do all this research, there are also a set of organizations, national organizations, capacity building across Black-led organizing movement infrastructure, and are also helping to redistribute funds to make sure that they get to groups on the ground. Things like Movement for Black Lives,
Are other people able to hear Maka? I'm not able to.
I'm not.
No.
Nwamaka, we can't hear you. We lost.
She has her mute on.
Yes, but now she's trying to solve the problem, whatever it is.
Yeah, let's just give her a moment, and while she reconnects, I'll just say that Amaka was talking through some of the things that I just dropped into the chat, and I think there's somebody with the name Thea. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. And they asked another really important question, which we can talk a little bit about. It really depends on, you know, your resources, but some folks might have invested resources that are also very much working counter to equity and justice and to the movement for Black lives and the demands of this moment. Oftentimes they can be invested in private prisons and other parts of the militarized economy. So if we have a minute, we didn't prepare content as much around that, but I appreciate that question. Amaka, if you're back, I was gonna kick it back to you to pick up on what you were flowing us through, but can you hear us? And do you wanna see if your audio is working?
You are muted right now.
Can anybody turn off her mute? The host? Wizard of Oz? There, no?
Oh, there we go.
There.
Hello?
Can
Yes.
you talk down?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I had the spinning wheel of death and I was in limbo land. I couldn't, so sorry, it started to stress me out. So, yeah, I think Jen covered it essentially. If you don't have relationships with groups directly on the ground, invite you to really support ecosystems where Black-led organizations have collectively organized themselves to help redistribute funds throughout their ecosystem of work. And I would offer that once again, we think that there's a moment to provide direct cash support to organizations on the ground. And our hope is that people also continue to center Black-led organizing, and I'd also offer Indigenous and immigrant-led organizing as part of their giving plan, as part of their giving portfolio, because we know that even once the uprisings are done, that there's still so much work to do, and that these are still the groups on the ground that are kind of leading those frontline efforts, and so that our giving should always kind of keep that that front of center. Thanks, Jen, for dropping in all those links to organizations and resources for sharing. Do we want to move to Q&A, or are you're on mute? Sorry, Jen.
Yeah, I was just going to add one other really quick point, which is I used to support a group that looked at the way grassroots environmental groups worked in alignment with like big national organizations who are doing work around like advocacy and policy change. And sometimes we'll talk about folks who are doing narrative work, like they're really trying to shift the conversation. And there can be a role for that sort of work. And there tends to be, at least with like larger funders, but also just generally in giving and donors, there tends to be more of like an appetite and a comfort with funding that kind of work, because it's often what a lot of us who identify as white have been conditioned to think are the levers for change. And we see ourselves in those strategies. But what they often don't do is really center the community and the levels of change and the ways of approaching change that folks on the ground and the grassroots leadership are trying to center. And sometimes they're even moving directly counter to. So we also just really want to lift up, as you're thinking about moving resources in this moment, you know, really lean into moving resources directly to the bail and bond funds, moving money to Black-led organizing and the local ecosystems, even though there can also be requests from the larger, we call them more like the grass top groups, just because sometimes there's tension around what to fund and where. And so I just wanted to lift that up as well.
Thank you, Jen. And yeah, I would love to move to Q&A, and yes, did catch your question in the chat box, and Yes, I think Jen and I can definitely follow up with some resources. Mission-aligned investing is oftentimes a body of work that we both lead and support on. And I think that we have a particular analysis around what it means to kind of invest in grassroots-led projects, as opposed to kind of having our investment sit purely on the public equities market. And so it may be helpful to like figure out how we have a follow-up conversation so people understand our assessment around what it means to invest and where our money sits. But do agree that there's an opportunity for people to look at screens, environmental, social, or governance screens if you are invested in the public equities market. And I would say one firm, Robichaudi and Phillipson, based out of San Francisco, is one of the leading firms that I've seen in terms of how they invest on the public equities market, if that is a place where you kind of keep your investment capital. But any other questions for us? You can go off mute or type it into the chat box.
Did you see the question in the chat there?
Solid Black run banks. So I know the Hope Credit Union CDFI is kind of one of the leading Black-led CDFIs. Also Berkshire Bank, the Berkshire Bank in Massachusetts is also leading in supporting Black projects. And I think the Black-owned banks, what I've seen is that Black-owned banks tend to be very local and very specific to your particular community. And regardless of the Black-owned bank, I think it's important to really look at who are they lending to and what are their policies around also deeply investing in supporting Black communities to ensure that it's not just Black governance, but we also have we have impact supporting Black communities. But Jen, any other Black-owned banks that kind of come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also a good opportunity. There's so much to share and unpack, but Nwamaka and I also work alongside some cooperative loan funds. So there's Black-owned banks. There's also institutions called community development finance institutions, which are not always the same thing, and sometimes can be very much acting in service to community, and sometimes, you know, not as much. It's really in understanding the work and the relationships and the communities in which they operate. So it's hard for us just to give general of good examples, but there are a handful of models across the country that are not only predominantly Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and like people of color and working class, like in the governance structure and serving those communities, but they also really lean into this thing that Nwamaka named in her opening, which is this concept of shared prosperity. So within this anti-racism, anti-capitalist frame that we work with, it's really important that we're not just thinking about, and this could be a whole other webinar topic, so I'll just kind of like share it and know that it probably needs to be unpacked more. We're not just talking about individual pathways to wealth. We're not just talking about individual entrepreneurs or owners of capital. We're actually really trying to reimagine an economy rooted in equity and justice in which there is shared prosperity. And there is more collective governing and stewardship of resources, including capital, land, and other forms of power and infrastructure. So the example that you all could look at just to kind of see what that might look like, there's a project called Ujima in Boston, the Ujima Cooperative Loan Fund, and we can drop that in the chat and or send it out. And there's another one, Cooperation Richmond in California. Just as two, again, examples. These aren't the end all be alls, they're just models. So just a couple things to, reflect on. Thanks, Nwamaka, I see you. Anything you would add to that point as well?
No, I think you got it.
And I will just say on the screening thing, how important it is, particularly in this moment, to ensure, like, if you have any kind of private or institutional assets, that you're not invested in private prisons. There's so much money that actually drives our carceral and militarized state. So definitely, as Nwamaka said, really encourage you to work with somebody to screen those. And then, you know, the other thing I think we could share, which would be a much longer conversation, but just to kind of seed this idea, is in addition to grants, as somebody was saying, sometimes communities and community projects are also looking for low interest or zero interest loans or other forms of capital and technical assistance in their projects. So we always encourage really being open to moving a variety of different kinds of capital to the work as part of that, also thinking about the investment side as well as the giving side.
And Chordata Capital is one of the links that I dropped in there, and individuals like Kate Poole, myself, and others, Jen, we could also help people think through how to structure direct investments in the event that people do want to move it some type of non-extractive investment to a group, but don't know how to structure that deal. So we can find individuals to support that as well. Great.
So what's the best way for people? Is it okay for people to reach out directly to you too, or would you rather them come through us?
I'll drop my email in the chat box. I would say I'm very behind on email, so I'll try my best to get back to people in a timely manner, but it may be a week or so, unfortunately.
I'd say the same, yeah. Are there any final questions? Or Nwamaka, maybe you and I can just give any kind of closing thoughts. I know we're coming to time. Annie and Adriana, I don't know if you have things too.
No, please use the time for yourself. We are just closing and go from there. Thank you.
Yeah, all I would offer is,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to give you last words. Is that okay?
Oh, okay.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I didn't have anything special to say. I was just gonna say thank you all for kind of participating in this conversation, inviting Jen and I to share. As you can kind of see, we were very much real-time processing and doing our own sense making. So thank you for holding us in that context. And thank you so much for Annie and Adriana for inviting us to also have this conversation in the context of mindfulness. I appreciate it, and thank you to Jen for really leaning in and helping to kind of share some content and framing with everybody.
Well, I think with that, I'll just say, yeah, thank you to you all. I really felt some of the things that folks reflected back around, you know, a little bit of a sense of overwhelm, and also like we scratched the surface of a lot of different things that are deep. And like I said, I just think there's so much need for reflection, unlearning, and inquiry in this moment. And it's nice to know that you all have a community of mindfulness to support you as you move through that and you move through these turbulent times. And yeah, just thank you for welcoming us into a little bit of this community and letting us riff and be with you in these, yeah, chaotic times. So thank you. Thank you to Annie and Adriana as well.
Annie, thanks.
Thank you so much, Nwamaka and Jen. This was really, as I shared with them during the breakout group, I sent 3 fire symbols to my daughter, Hannah, to describe how it was going. I just think it was amazing and so powerful. And I want to share with everyone here who's in the mindfulness tradition that we have started a group, a very small group, and some of the people are on here today that talk about Dharma and money on a regular basis. And I would love to have more groups like that going, where we talk about how does our practice inform our giving, and how can we make reparations and have those kind of conversations. So please reach out to me, Annie at circleyoga.com, if you would like to be part of those kind of conversations. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this topic. So please do that. And I will finish with a bell after Adriana says her goodbyes.
Thank you, Jennifer and Nwamaka again. It was really helpful. It was really informative. It was like enlightening to know or to talk even about this topic, which we never talk about. So thank you so much for your wisdom, for your work, for your incredible clarity to tell things. So it is amazing. There are some people that still have their hands raising, so maybe they can send you their questions later. Is that okay? Yes, there is Gabriela. Gabi, you can send them in an email your question if you don't mind. Thank you so much to everyone, and I think it's time to close with the bell, and maybe later we can do some announcement if people are still there. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Yes, thank you for coming, because without you, we wouldn't be able to have a webinar. And as Adriana often says, it's like we're all learning together. Like we do these because we want to learn too. So thank you for coming and for sharing your wisdom. And we'll finish with the sound of the bell, coming back into our bodies and regrounding and just holding all of that ideas and information that came in and just seeing how it all lands in our bodies, so that we can be informed about what might be the next right steps for us in this time. Dear friends, be safe, be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nwamaka. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.